Well, climate, you're not rich if you're also dead, right?
Gary
Shami,
Younge.
how you doing?
I'm good. Welcome to the Speakeasy.
Is there not supposed to be like gin or
Absolutely.
some kind of mixer?
It's hidden in your.
Oh right,
It's
you
hidden
spiked
in your
my coffee.
Spike the coffee.
Okay.
So, I mean, you're familiar with the historic concept of the Speakeasy, of course.
I am.
Slightly shady, slightly under the radar. Difficult. Little bit dodge. Some difficult times outside, possibly between the wars, but a place for a little bit of freedom, a little bit of conversation.
Counterculture.
Thank you.
Counterculture.
I knew you would find exactly the right phrase. So look, firstly, congratulations on the Orwell Prize.
Thank you.
Congratulations on Dispatches from the Diaspora, and now on Pigeonholed, which is rather a beautiful publication from Faber, who are
clever.
doing you proud, aren't they?
They
really?
are. That's very clever.
Rightly so. And of course, it's the subtitle is "Creative Freedom as an Act of Resistance." Can we just talk a little bit in the abstract about writing as resistance?
Yeah. So that book, by the way, which is an interesting kind of, given the moment that we're in terms of distraction and all of that, what's quite interesting is that it was a lecture that they've made into a book, which is a bit like a pamphlet, which is a kind of return to the 19th century, really. You do a speech at Conway Hall and then they put out a pamphlet, and the theme of it is, for me, freedom is the goal. A personal freedom that allows me not to know my place. And that as a writer, in my case, there are all kinds of pressures not to be free. First of all, I'm operating in a world that would prefer my silence, given my race and my politics. But secondly, when I became a journalist, there were very few other black journalists, and there was this sense of like, what do we want you for? And there wasn't this sense of, we want you to write what you want to write. It was like, either the advice was, you can only write about race, or you should never write about race. And
for fear of being pigeonholed.
Yeah. So sort of, leave your, don't take yourself to work day, I call it in the book. And then a pressure from below, which I actually welcome, from underrepresented people, black people mostly, and people of colour, saying, why aren't you writing more about this? Why aren't you doing that? Why is your organisation doing this? And the challenge to, in a responsible way, in a progressive way, write about the things that engage you, that you think are important, is an act of it's an act of resistance, that you have to resist against a range of pressures, some sort of fundamentalist pressures from your own community. You shouldn't write about gay life in Jamaica. You make us look bad. You shouldn't write about, people doing this or that, or knife crime or whatever. But then, other people saying, well, only write about race or never write about race. And so to insist on your own voice and using it in your own way, I argue is an act of resistance. Of course, it's not the same act of resistance as, people fighting terror and genocide and all that. It's not that. But I do think that those things are connected in terms of who do we hear from, who has a voice, what are they allowed to say, what is off limits, what kind of subjects are deemed acceptable for me or somebody else, or somebody else is underrepresented. In my case, it's race, but my point in the book
I love
is...
that. So Pigeonholed is this beautiful lecture that is now a pamphlet, as you say, and actually polemic ought to have a voice and quite an oral voice. And you've been writing columns primarily, but not exclusively, for The Guardian for about 30 years. And
there's an oral
nature to polemical writing anyway. So there's a perfect match there. But I love the pigeonholed concept, because didn't someone say to you, but pigeons can fly?
Carys Afoko, yeah.
Brilliant.
Yeah, pigeons
On
can
the one
fly.
hand, let's not be pigeonholed, but let's remember even pigeons can fly.
Yeah, well, and that thing of being defined by what other people think of you, which is once again an act of freedom, not to be defined that way, to break away from, you will be pigeonholed, you will be thought of. That it all happens in the passive voice. And what happens there is that you have these people in your head telling you not to go one way, not to go another way.
Or you must go this way.
Or you must go this way. And that kind of just to insist on going the way that you think is best, even if it's not right, it's your way.
Well, but on that again, you talk about James Baldwin saying to a group of black students, I promise not to let you down. I promise to represent you. And you talk about the delicacy and difficulty of that. And I think it's lovely that you do that, because I think of you as the James Baldwin of our generation. And I had thought of you as a British James Baldwin, but actually I think you're transatlantic and beyond that. So I will just say I think you're the James Baldwin of our generation. But how interesting that, with great respect, you nonetheless say that's a tricky one to say I will represent you, right?
Well, because nobody's elected me, and I'm not accountable to anyone, so I can't. Yeah. It's really important to me that I'm responsible, and it's really important to me that I don't. Through my writing, it is really important to me that through my writing I don't make vulnerable people more vulnerable. And nobody elected me,
Me neither. Me neither.
And so that's quite an important thing to remember, because there's the burden of representation, but then there's just the burden of responsibility. And I say in the pamphlet, because in the olden days when people were first only indifferent, as Shonda Rhimes would say, like, they would talk about themselves being the ambassador, and a few people have said to me in the past, you're like an ambassador. I'm like, no, you see, ambassadors get expense accounts, they get immunity,
diplomatic immunity.
Yeah, they get like staff. I am, if I'm a diplomat, then where's my country and where's my expense account? And if I don't have either of those things, then that's not what I'm doing. And
where's my country? Well, look, in recent years, that was the whole row. I think it was maybe Theresa May, but she may have got it from other people. You've got somewhere or nowhere. If you're a citizen of everywhere,
the world, you're a citizen of nowhere.
Which really hurt me, actually.
Why is that?
Because I am a bit of an everywhere person. I have to be careful about this, because I don't want to ignore the importance of place and belonging and all of that. But at the same time, I'm the daughter of migrants. I don't speak my mother tongue, never have. I'm very, very everywhere and universalist, even human rights, which is kind of my ultimate belief system, is internationalist and is about universalism and internationalism, and that's what rubs some people up the wrong way. And I have to understand why people voted for Brexit, etc., etc.
Yeah, I'm similar. I was 17, 18 before I admitted that I was British. I used to say, because British people would tell me I wasn't British, go back to where you come from and all that kind of stuff. It took for me to be in Sudan, working in Sudan for a year in a refugee school, and first of all to see people who really didn't have any country, because they couldn't go back to the country that they were from, and they were looking to go somewhere else, and thinking, yeah, okay, so you've got a passport and you actually have a place that you grew up in, so it's not really going to work. But also, but you are, just admit you are from there, you're not from somewhere else. Yeah. And, though, thinking, well, you can be from more places than one. and that
you can have multiple identities.
You can have multiple identities. In fact, we all do. We all have,
totally
many identities and just one. So it's like, I'm straight, I'm black, I'm male, I was born in Stevenage, I live in London, and I'm Gary. And
can
both
I try
of those
something
things
out on
can
you,
be
Gary?
true.
And please slap me down, because I really think you're more of an expert on this. I have this kind of theory that there are just kind of two approaches, not 2.5, not 15, two approaches to identity. One is the supermarket checkout, and the other is the military checkpoint.
Oh, hello.
Right?
Mm-hmm.
Just for a laugh. Let me try this out. Right. So the supermarket checkout version of identity is me. Think of not a great big supermarket, but just one of these little metro ones where you might pop in with a basket on a Friday night. And you're only going to
M&S Food Hall.
That kind of M&S, darling. Yeah, absolutely. This isn't just identity. This is it, right. So, and you're popping in on a Friday night with a basket, and you choose, subject to the economic problem, which is always a problem.
Yeah.
Subject to that, you choose what to put in your basket, and there's a bit of a queue, and sometimes people are having a nose and they're having a look at what's in your basket, and maybe making assumptions about you on the basis of what products you put in the basket. Were you going to, a loved one's birthday and you put a bottle of champagne in that day, or maybe it was just a can of beer. Was there a curry, or was there some cheese? Whatever it is, but subject to the economics, which are very real, you decide what goes in and what comes out if there isn't enough money. And people make these assumptions, but you have an element of control. And it can be different from one Friday night to the next and one day to the next. Alternative, military checkpoint. You go and present yourself at the checkpoint. And I know you've been through a few checkpoints in your time, Gary, because I've read what you've written about them. You really don't have very much control at all. You present yourself to the person with the gun and the uniform, and they want your papers. Sometimes they even want to do a strip search, and they decide what your identity is and whether you pass or you go. And this is a caricature, but what I'm saying is I kind of prefer the supermarket checkout to the military checkpoint, and I think we would all want the former for our kids and our loved ones, not the latter. What do you reckon?
Yeah, no, that's a good one. That is. I hadn't heard that one before. You made that up.
I made that up.
Yeah, that's the one I've used in the past, which is, I think, vastly inferior. Actually, is identity is like the gas you put in your tank, and then you have to drive on the road with everybody else. And what it doesn't get to is the point that, next week I might put different stuff in my basket. That kind of within, September the 10th, someone has a Muslim name, they like a beer, they like a bacon sarnie, their dad or their grandfather was Muslim. Whatever, it's not something that they deny, it's just not something they particularly embrace. September the 12th, I think in 2001, they're asked to account for all the things. And suddenly they are Muslim in a way that they
Whether they
had
like
not,
it or
whether
not.
they like it or not.
They might even be a Sikh.
They might even, yes.
Travelling on the underground the day after 9/11, and people have decided they're a Muslim.
Well, exactly. Like the first Islamophobic attack in America was on a Sikh.
Yeah. And that's the military checkpoint.
Yeah.
Because you have no control.
You have no control. And that kind of... I did a book a while back called Who Are We? And the point I was trying to make in the book is that identity is not just a good place to start, it's an inevitable place to start. You have to go to the shops at some point, otherwise you'll starve. But it's a terrible place to finish. And when you're in the checkpoint, that's when it's finished. Like, you're this and you're nothing else. Yeah. And you're what I tell you and you're nothing else. And that I hate all kinds of fundamentalism. It's just that term fundamentalism is only really used primarily with Muslims and occasionally with Christians, but I think there's nationalist fundamentalism, there's racial fundamentalism, there's gendered fundamentalism.
Indeed.
There are anything that says this and nothing else, and that anybody...
No room for doubt.
No room for doubt, for transgression.
On race, I think one of the things that probably benefits your insight is that you have, even from quite a young age, lived and worked in a number of different places. And so you've both experienced racism and race politics and observed it as a compare and contrast. Do you want to say a little bit more about some of the comparisons and the contrasts, you know, the Soviet Union versus the US versus the UK versus France?
Well, I mean, the first thing I'd say is that racism, like so many things, it's a language with many dialects. So there's nowhere in the world where it's not spoken. It might be against the Uyghurs. It might be, it might be against the Roma. It doesn't have to be against black people. It could be against Jews. And everywhere it's spoken somewhat differently. And the way that the inflection is contingent on time and place. So I speak British racism fluently. I was inducted in it. I was raised in it. When somebody says, it's very cold, isn't it? Not like where you're from. I know what they mean. I know where they're coming from. When Keir Starmer says island of strangers, I hear it. I know what he's saying. Now, I lived in America for 12 years, and there I was learning a new dialect. And I had to, not least, my partner is African American, but my kids were born there. An example, and I talk about this in Pigeonholed, is I studied French and Russian. I studied to be a translator and an interpreter. And I spent 6 months in Paris and 6 months in what was then Leningrad. And Paris was the most intensely racist experience of my life. I was beaten up by the cops. I was stopped and searched at least 3 times a week. People would ask me what colour you are when you call for a flat. There were really blatant colour bars in lots of clubs and even restaurants. When that was over, so it was miserable. And then when that was over, I went to Leningrad, and I was living with a Jewish family there. And it was a very particular time. It was 1991. The Soviet Union was about to collapse. America had just won the first Gulf War.
Just before the end of history.
Just before the end of history. And so there was an aspiration towards America. And what with my plaits, I had plaits at the time, and my sneakers and whatever, people knew, quote unquote, they looked in my basket of goods and they knew that I wasn't African. Africans were catching hell because they were considered a mark of the failed regime or the failing regime, all these solidarity projects. The Cubans were catching hell, but I looked like American. And so whereas in Paris I couldn't get a cab for love nor money, in Leningrad, cars would stop and become cabs.
Because you're going to have dollars.
Because I'm going to have dollars. It's the only time in my life when I've been able to vouch for white people. So like,
it's all right. He's with
me. Yeah, they're with me. Yeah. You go into a hotel, and you'll be like.
That's like Mallory Blackman territory, isn't it? That's Gary's noughts and crosses experience.
And it's the only time in my life, bearing in mind I was a student with no parents by that stage. No meaningful parents. It's the only time that anyone has looked at me and thought, here comes money. It's the only time that the sight of me has been associated with wealth.
Maybe that will come again.
Yeah, I doubt it.
Maybe that will come again. Could you say a little bit more about the transatlantic comparison in particular? The British race conversation as opposed to the American one, the translation between the two. I'm thinking Black Lives Matter, defund the police and whatever, but also the way we look at American racism and perhaps the way they look at old world racism.
Yeah, I mean, they don't look at us much, to be honest.
No.
You know, that's one of those weird, when the Brits go on about a special relationship, it's only really special to Britain. It's like, if America was a boyfriend, you'd be saying, he's not really that into you, you know, not really. But that, first of all,
America was a boyfriend. Loving it.
Everything in America is more deadly because they have guns.
Yeah.
So domestic violence is more deadly. The homophobia is more deadly. The racism is more deadly. There are a range of things that might kick off here, but not kill you, that there would kill you. That's quite an important thing. The other important thing, distinction, is that while America had segregation on its soil, it had its civil rights movement on its soil, and so there is an extent to which some things are inescapable. Nobody in America would say we had nothing to do with slavery or we had nothing to do with segregation. Even Donald Trump wouldn't say that. They'll say it's all gone now and shut up. But there is a level of deniability that is not possible. Whereas here, all of that happened abroad, or most of it. Our segregation, our colonialism, and so and our civil rights movement.
Huge denialism.
It's a crazy amount of denial that takes place here about where we are and what we've done. There was this great document I found in the National Archives, which was a survey by the Colonial Office in 1948, which asked people if they could name any colonies. Half of British people, 1948, bear in mind, Britain runs, like even Sudan is not free or Ghana's not free. Britain runs a lot of Africa, much of the Caribbean, much of Asia. Half people can't name a colony. At least one person suggests Lincolnshire might be a colony, which I do think is funny now that, you know, they voted Brexit, they voted reform. And so you get this sense of Britain denying it even while they're doing it.
Yeah.
And then if you project that and you think, 1948, that was the year that Windrush docked. So you have these people who apparently come from nowhere in large numbers of people's minds.
But
and
they were only here because you were over there,
yeah,
right?
and the Sivanandan quote. And that we still do that. So they go on about the small boats.
Yeah.
Well, most people, the three main places people in small boats come from at the moment, as far as I understand, are Iraq, Afghanistan, and Iran.
Where we have been.
Two places that we bombed and unsailed, and one place whose democracy we undermined because they were irritating us by keeping too many of their oil profits.
And of course, human rights are a great justification for war over there, but not refugee protection over here.
Well, yeah.
The other thing that gets me about this whole small boats concept is that, you know, every nation has to have its national binding myths. And I don't mean myths as in they're not true. There's an element of truth. So the Dunkirk spirit that is really part of the heart of the British myth. I thought the Dunkirk spirit was about saving people in little boats, not turning the little boats away.
Wrong, or letting people drown.
It's kind of the reverse Dunkirk spirit, or the anti-Dunkirk spirit. We won't be having that spirit in our speakeasy.
No. And there's... Well, so, I mean, to go back to your question about the States, that is one of the other things that's quite interesting, is that the degree to which Britain's racial conversation is tied up with migration, which is not so true in America.
Because it's transportation and it's slave.
Yeah.
I mean, do you, for example, think it's significant or accidental that the first black American president was not descended from slaves?
I think it was almost inevitable. And the next viable candidate was also not, well, she was a descendant of slaves, but she was also an immigrant. So she was a descendant of slaves via Kamala Harris's dad was Jamaican and of African descent. So her descent to slavery through there, but that he was also an immigrant. And that matters. not because there was any sort of fundamentalism about the African American descendants of slave experience, but because, for example, Obama, in when he makes the speech that makes him really nationally famous in 2004, when he's introducing John Kerry, and he says, "My father came to America, a magical place." His dad came to America from Kenya in 1959. I'm sure it was magical for him, not least because Kenya was a colonial state, so going from one colonial state to an apartheid state, and he went to Hawaii, so he didn't go to the worst of it. But 1959, African Americans hadn't secured the right to vote at that stage. Brown versus Board of Education had been passed, but most of it had not been implemented. This is 4 years before the March on Washington. 4 years before 4 little girls are killed in the 16th Street Baptist Church. He's not lying, Obama, but he has access to a story
which is
that Jesse Jackson doesn't have an access to.
It's a migration story, not a forced transportation story.
And it's a migration story in a country where people, unlike here, like to extol even Trump or the worst of the kind of Fox News people will talk about their Irish heritage or their German heritage or whatever. So that when there is a certain migration narrative that you can plug into, and the other thing
that is as big a part of the American myth or dream or story as the Dunkirk spirit is in Britain, right?
Yeah, oh, very much so.
Or Magna Carta, remember her? Did she die in vain? Did she die in vain?
And it's also why Obama was vulnerable to things like his birth certificate. And was he born in Kenya? No one would have asked Jesse Jackson that, but it's not an accident. No. You know what? I heard one good description, which was something to the tune of, "We're used to the idea of the front door being closed. And so we came in through the back door, and that was the only back door we had." Like that, in the same way that it didn't surprise me that the first non-white leader of Britain would be from the Asian community.
And
or
Tory.
Yeah. Well, because these people, when they travel, if you travel on the left, you are probably part of a movement. Or you come with a certain set of expectations. So when you move, you travel slower and less far, but you take more people with you. Whereas if you're on the right and you're from the cult of the individual, then you travel by yourself. When Kemi Badenoch becomes leader of the Tory party, that's great for Kemi Badenoch, but it doesn't have any impact on other black people particularly, and she doesn't want it to. They actually are kind of quite emphatic about saying, "Well, I'm not bringing anybody with me.
No, I'm burning the bridge."
Yeah, exactly.
I'm firebombing the bridge behind me, or the
I've
ladder.
climbed up the ladder, and now I'm going to burn the ladder, and I'm going to claim there was no ladder.
I have to say, I find that quite difficult. You know, I did. You know, if I'm honest, I was particularly, perhaps overly, personally upset by Rishi Sunak and Suella Braverman and Priti Patel and their "stop the boats" narrative when they are the children of migrants.
Yeah, well,
they may have come on planes and not boats, but you know, and I think back to like Ronald Reagan in the 80s and his speech in Germany: "I am a refugee. I am a Laotian, a Cambodian, a Mosquito Indian. I am a person in a small boat." And now this narrative, actually on both sides of the Atlantic, this anti-migration narrative, which is tricky to separate from racism.
Yeah, and they're not the same thing, although they are kind of kissing cousins. The thing I find most frustrating here is the ignorance that is embedded in the conversation. That kind of people try and they claim they're talking about it from a historical point of view or from a common sense point of view, and it's like, look, you're going to cut aid and increase the military. Well, why do you think people are coming? They're coming because you're bombing them, or they're being bombed, and they're coming because they for reasons that are to do with our history, they don't have enough where they're coming from. So if you cut aid and you increase military spending, and then you close, what do you expect people to do?
You're not seeing the relationship between over there and
over here.
Which is a very weird dissonance, isn't it?
It is. It is very
weird. Can we
weird.
go back to this kind of lost in translation thing? The Anglo-American divided by a common language. Not to quote, the great man Winston Churchill, but divided by a common language. I found that quite interesting in the context of Black Lives Matter. So thinking back to the pandemic and the resurgence after George Floyd's murder of the Black Lives Matter movement. Do you remember the rows about defund the police?
Yeah.
And I don't know, I'd be really interested in your take on this. To me, that is a slogan that works in the US and doesn't work in Britain, because the US is a security state and not a welfare state. Here in Britain, we, after years of austerity, I think even the most bleeding heart liberal progressive like me would say actually the police were insufficiently resourced by the time we got to the pandemic, be a slashing in police numbers, etc., etc. That's austerity. But in the US, there's no welfare state. And to me, in the US, defund the police is like, please fund the community and education and youth groups and health.
Yeah, I think that even in the US, it was one of those slogans that took too much explanation.
Yeah, to be a good slogan.
Because people got it mixed up with police abolition.
Yeah.
Whereas really, the way I heard it, is it's about a public health approach to that. At the moment in Britain, we did a series on knife crime at The Guardian, and what we found was, first of all, the police were being asked or demanded to police austerity. So all of the fallout from austerity. So you've got cuts in child and adolescent mental health services. You've got cuts in youth services. You've got the academisation of schools where they are off-rolling students and excluding students routinely. And then the police are supposed to pick up the slack from these kids, many of whom aren't well, who have nowhere else to go, who have been kicked out of school. And that kind of... and so I saw defund the police as like a public health approach to policing. An awful lot of what the police are being asked to do, and this is even true in America for the reasons that you point out, have nothing to do with policing. They're about health and safety and education. And if you've got a 15-year-old kid in a working class, in a housing estate where their parents are working 2 jobs to get by, they've been kicked out of school and they have some kind of mental health challenge, particularly post-COVID, then what do you think is going to happen? And you've cut all the youth services. There's nowhere for them to go. So this kind of, the hand-wringing around, say, knife crime and the sense of like blaming the parents, that like, oh, it's too many computer games. No. I mean, there is an issue with masculinity, absolutely, with these things, I think, which is a slightly different conversation.
And social media.
And all that. So all of that kind of stuff kind of caffeinates what would be school rows, adolescent beefs can be caffeinated. But a lot of it is just kind of us absolutely underfunding young people and then expecting them to kind of get by and be okay, and they're not okay.
So going back to the pandemic and that resurgence of the Black Lives Matter movement and really translating across the world and certainly to the UK and so on, simultaneously or coterminously, we saw a big resurgence in the climate movement, and I noticed a coalescence actually between the race equality and climate change movements. I remember speaking at a demo in Parliament Square and feeling quite moved by seeing the Black Lives Matter flags next to the hourglass of the whatever it was, Extinction Rebellion, and let's be honest, the climate protests were mostly white, and the race equality protesters were not. But seeing that kind of coalition, I thought was quite exciting. And I think it came out of protest being suppressed.
Yeah.
And therefore the resistance unites. Did you get a sense of that?
Yeah, yeah, and I wish there was a greater sense of urgency, particularly in the climate change movement, to not diversity, but for diversity's sake, but a pollination of those demands that kind of land as much in black communities as elsewhere. It does, because the overlap is clear. And if you look on the global stage at who is really running the show, and you see kind of the range of ways in which climate is forcing migration, but also kind of one of the most remarkable speeches at the last, I think the COP before last, the one in Glasgow, was Mia Mottley from the Prime Minister of Barbados. Yeah. These kind of Caribbean islands or Bangladesh, these are places that where it's not a kind of like, sometime in the future, blah, blah, blah.
It's
like
very real.
Very real and very present. The hurricanes are barreling down and they're coming earlier and they're staying later. And these are the people globally who are the most vocal and the most insistent. And so that connection between race, colonialism, climate is weirdly being made more forcefully at the top than it is at the bottom.
But I think
things are moving.
Only more can come for those reasons. And the wealthiest countries, because of the Industrial Revolution, et cetera, are also the ones who, arguably should be thinking about reparations, et cetera. And whatever your view on all of that, rich countries need to help poorer countries if we're going to have any hope of taking on this emergency, right?
Well, I mean, there is a world which I feel they're trying to bring, that they're trying to create, where you build ever higher gates and you fortify your borders, you let people drown on their way. If they arrive, you either put them in jail or a form of prison, or you export them to some island, Rwanda or Albania or wherever.
Again.
And that kind of that is a dystopian world that they think is the answer to this, or and
we're
climate
all in
change.
It together.
Climate. You're not rich if you're also dead, right? And that kind of that's where the planet's burning. I mean, and in the same way that while society discriminated against in terms of race against people, COVID, it followed the path of those discriminations. So non-white people were more likely, but anyone could get it, including Boris Johnson. When you look at these floods and hurricanes and so on, it's only going to be so long before they are coming our way. They're already battering the hell out of Florida. They're flooding Spain. They're crushing Germany. So there's no referendum that's going to stop that. You can opt out of the European Union. You can't opt out of the planet.
The climate, no. But you'll never see that sort of written about in the Telegraph and the Mail, because people again choose which aspect, even of their favourite political icon that they want to big up. But look, Gary, you're now Professor Gary.
I am Professor Gary.
So
I insist on it at home.
I think that's very important.
My daughter's like, "You're a poopy head," and I said,
no,
Professor Poopy Head
to
thank
you, young lady. so look, after this glittering career as a journalist and a man of letters and words, you are now very firmly in the academy. You're a professor of sociology, I think, at Manchester. But haven't you picked the moment to go? I mean, you don't go looking for trouble; it just follows you, right? It
does follow me.
So you're now in the academy, which has become, which certainly painted as the front line of the so-called culture war, right? And the intergenerational anti-woke backlash, etc., etc. How are you finding some of those issues?
It's intriguing to me the degree to which, for example, just a few years ago, there was a really big thing about free speech on campus. And then Palestine happened.
And we don't believe on free speech on campus anymore.
Yeah, now free speech become too expensive. Well, it becomes very clear it's free speech for you, but
it's for me and not for you, right? My speech is free. Yours is a bit more expensive.
Yeah, or too expensive for all of us, you know, and that. So it's an intriguing time, not least because the sector is also under a massive amount of pressure because it's horribly underfunded.
Yeah.
But that, you know, I think that the role of universities is to, first of all, teach people things, but also teach people how to think about the world. Not to teach them to have a particular opinion, but how to construct an argument. And increasingly, that's not what the system wants. It doesn't want critical thinkers, you know. So there was an interesting going back down the line to schools and academisation. I live in Hackney, where a lot of the schools are like boot camps. And
discipline, security.
Discipline, yeah, and kind of any more than 3 people talking is a gang, and if you're walking on the wrong side of, if you're walking on the wrong side of the corridor, that's a detention, and if your shoelaces are undone, that's a detention, and all of this stuff. And it's really, I remember talking to a Scottish friend who worked in the Scottish Parliament and telling him about the challenges of finding schools that are like that are state schools. Well, they're not state schools, they're academies. And he said, well, but how do you get good citizens out of that? And I said, you know what's really interesting is that nobody's really asking that question.
Nobody really wants good citizens, do they? They want good little good little breeders and good little soldiers.
Yeah, I know. And
the girls being the breeders and the boys being the soldiers for the empire.
And so there is a real challenge in terms of trying to create a climate where the emphasis isn't on passing the exam or getting the right answer, but on having the critical methods and being an active citizen. And honestly, I think now more than ever, when we have people being picked off the street in America and put in jail and they haven't committed a crime, when we have books being banned, and all kinds of speech being horribly policed, and fascism being a mainstream ideology in Europe, more now than ever, we need people to be able to think critically and to have a sense of their values as citizens, not necessarily because they're going to agree with me, but because by and large, the way these bad things happen is that people sleepwalk into them, not that they run at them kind of full-throated, arms are wide, saying, you know, let's have camps. They kind of, okay, go along with that. Yeah, I guess those are a bit of a problem, and those people, you know, they do that. And without the critical thought, it would be very easy to sleep into dark times.
This is a real project for you now. This is one of the reasons perhaps why you are Professor Gary, and why you want to be in universities and you want to be engaging with younger people.
I mean, it wasn't the thing that drove me there. What drove me there was thinking, do I want to die here at The Guardian? And realising when I got to around 50, I'd rather die somewhere else. And wanting to say more about less, not wanting to have a thought every. I used to have to have a thought. Yeah, I used to have a thought every Thursday, whether I wanted one or not. And
a bit of long form and a bit of reflection and analysis.
Yeah, and that kind of, and I guess that kind of thing of finding ways to impart what you've learned. I went back to an interview I did with Tony Benn, which was a lot of fun. He was doing all of these meetings around the country. I went to 3 of them. One was in Cornwall,
Yeah.
One was in Sunderland.
That was when he gave up Parliament to spend more time on politics.
Yeah. And they were all sold out. And he said, what do you do when you get old? He said, you don't whine about how... He'd been giving this some thought. And he said, you don't whine about how good things were. You don't kind of berate people because they're not doing it the way that you would. You encourage people. And I kind of did take that to heart. And
he did. And he really, really did. I mean, he was in that phase almost when I first became Director of Liberty. And one of the first public speeches I did in Parliament, he was to speak just before me. And he had this text and I didn't. And I was very nervous. And he got up to speak and he looked at me and he tore up his text and just gave a very low-key conversational speech instead of the great peroration that he planned. And he did that, I know, as an act of generosity. But you have so much generosity, Gary, and including the time you spent with us here in the Speakeasy. Gary, thank you so much.
Thank you.